The Duke knocked on the door. She greeted him with a bright smile. It had been a week since the day she fainted. Since that day, the Duke would come in and put his hand on her forehead to check her fever, as if in greeting. They had gotten more familiar with each other, but it still made her quite shy. He stated happily that her fever had gone down and asked her to join him for lunch. As they walked down the hallway, he told her to stay here since he'd be here more often due to the subjugation of the demonic beasts. He mentioned the painting tools he saw in her bag and suggested she go to the rooftop at dawn to watch the beautiful sunrise, but to be careful because of how weak her body was. He then began his lengthy list of nagging, concerned for her well-being. He told her about how she seemed during the engagement ceremony, as if she was being dragged around against her will. She thought back to how true that was. The engagement was arranged without Karina's consent, and because of Leah's sickness, her parents didn't attend. He apologized for how cold he was on that day and explained he had only followed the late Duke's will. He said gently, if she didn't like something, all she had to do was tell him. She wrung her hands nervously. She was never allowed to say that before. They decided to have lunch in the greenhouse. She looked around, fascination in her eyes. The food was brought in as they spoke about the glass greenhouse and its beauty. She noticed how considerate and caring he was, which was quite different from his blunt personality. As she looked at him, Karina apologized for coming to the north without telling him. He told her it didn't matter and apologized for their first meeting here in the north. It wasn't because he didn't like her, but because traveling to the north was extremely dangerous. She thought about telling him about her artist's disease, but second-guessed herself because she was afraid he might turn his back on her. She didn't want to lose the warmth she'd gained. As she gazed out the window, she thought about how much fun she had during lunch. She decided to go up to the rooftop. As she opened the door, the sight that greeted her stole her breath. What a splendid sunrise! She couldn't help but draw this awe-inspiring scene. She looked up, startled as the Duke grabbed her hand with a furious furrow to his forehead. He scolded her for staying out so long in the cold. Back inside, she sat wrapped in blankets. She hadn't realized she'd been out there for so long. She said as much and giggled obliviously, but he only scolded her more harshly. He was curious about her drawing. As she handed it to him, she told Million about her simple, inexperienced hand in drawing, compared to her siblings who were exceptionally talented. He stared for a minute, silent, but then told her how amazing her drawing was. She was too modest and harsh on herself. She blushed, surprised by the unexpected praise. He was the first person to compliment her like this, and she found it hard to believe his words. He expressed his interest in the finished drawing, and she agreed to show him. As the doctor came in, the Duke explained all that had happened since she arrived. She would need a thorough examination. The doctor reached for her, but she hid. She didn't want to see doctors because of her disease. She wanted to keep her disease hidden for as long as possible. She tried to persuade him, but he grabbed her and sat her on the bed. She would indeed be getting a checkup. The doctor scolded Million for treating the lady in such a way, but he remained oblivious to his brutish behavior. The doctor checked her pulse and was shocked at what he found. As he laid her down gently, he examined her further and found her pulse irregular and weak. The sound of her heart was distant and faint. He told the Duke Karina showed symptoms of art disease, which was uncommon in the north but not in the south. The doctor explained the types of artist's disease. The mildest is reduced stamina. Some lose one of their senses or control of a limb, but the very rarest is the loss of one's life. The Duke seemed bewildered because this was never mentioned during their engagement, and he couldn't ask Karina, who was feverish and asleep. He sent a message to a close acquaintance, Periel, who might know more about this since his family was known to sponsor young artists. The Count received a report that his men had lost sight of Karina after she had arrived in the capital. It had been a month since she left home. As he went through the report, he glanced at the photographs on his desk. He noticed that he didn't have a single portrait of Karina like he did of his other children. As he walked down the hallway, he realized Karina's room was the farthest in, at the end of the hallway. He recalled once, when Karina was much younger, asking for a room closer because of how scary the hallway was. But he scolded her harshly because she was the older sister and she needed to stop acting immaturely. He couldn't remember the last time he visited her room, other than a month ago when he scolded her so severely. He walked into her room, first noting how cramped it was for a young lady. He then saw her very few cheap-looking art tools and said with a dismissive tone, she should have asked if she needed something. The Count opened her drawer and saw her paintings. He took out one, and it was a picture of their family on an outing just after Abelia got better. He couldn't recall if Karina was with them. The Countess called out his name from the doorway. They looked at Karina's painting. The Countess told the Count about how Karina would show her paintings from time to time, but at some point she stopped. She thought Karina had stopped that short hobby. The Countess told him to inform the Duke, but of course, Karina couldn't have gone to the north. The journey was much too perilous for a young lady to endure. As Abelia spoke to Nocturne, she mentioned the painting she took out of her older sister's room. She showed Nocturne, proud of her sister's magnificent work, and he was surprised by how amazing that painting was. It was almost as if looking out a real window. He stood up suddenly as he remembered that his mentor mentioned a sick lady. He needed to confirm if the patient his mentor went after was indeed Karina. As he looked at the patient's list, Nocturne was shocked to find that it was, in fact, Karina who had artist's disease. As Karina slowly awoke, she looked around the room, disoriented. Had the Duke left? Karina was parched and noticed a jug of water on the bedside table. She realized Million had been considerate enough to leave it there. It wasn't right to come here, Karina thought, sadly. She buried her head in the pillow, hoping he hadn't found out about her disease. When she found out about her disease, she wasn't sure if she should have told her family. Would she have gotten the attention she so longed for, but at the cost of her wretched life? Like grains of sand slipping through her fingers no matter how much she tried to grasp it. In order to receive the attention she so desperately sought for, she had to become miserable. That's why she ran to the north, knowing they wouldn't have followed. She regretted coming here because while she had already accepted her impending death, his kindness made her want to live more than ever. Tears dripped down her cheeks. She whispered to herself, "How could you be so kind to me?" She had learnt at an early age that there was rank to everything. She had hoped that he would have ignored her in her last remaining days. They wouldn't have grown closer, and he wouldn't feel even the slightest sense of guilt when she took her last breath. She remembered a book she once saw with a charm to erase memories. If only she had it, she would have erased his memories, as hard as it would have been. Her ability was to create anything as long as she could see, feel, and understand it. In extreme cases, her ability was powerful enough to bring the dead back to life. If only for a moment. All she had to do was draw it. Should she leave for an abbey? Maybe. That would stop this growing fondness for him. She startled as Million spoke aloud. She hadn't noticed him come in. "What type is it?" he asked in a low tone. She kept silent. He knew. She didn't want to answer. She apologized for coming here without telling him, but he sighed tiredly. He asked again, but instead of answering, she told him that she wouldn't do anything to annoy him, or if he could just act like he didn't care about her. If not, she could leave. He asked her once again, frustration straining his voice, but still, she refused to answer. He told her that there were no doctors in the north that could help her, and she couldn't leave because of the demonic beasts, but she just shook her head. There were no doctors that could cure her anyway. He suggested she stop performing her art, but she just looked at him and smiled sadly. With a soft, gentle tone, she said, "If I stop drawing, then I'll have nothing in my life. It's a friend I've had all my life." He asked her to clearly explain this time why she came here. It wasn't really to calm down after an argument with her family. He was certain. She didn't know where to start. She had never spoken her thoughts aloud before. As she began, she told him about the neglect and all she had to endure from her family. She told him she'd only found out about her art disease a week before she came to the north. She needed to find a quiet place to gather her thoughts and get away from her family, and the north was the perfect place for this, always being put as last priority when it came to her siblings or having to share her precious presence with her siblings. Being compared to her siblings, while they were getting compliments, she was ignored. She felt wronged by her parents and decided to leave. She didn't want to continue that vicious cycle. She glanced up, embarrassed about all she said, and called herself childish. But the Duke rebuked her. He said being childish was when he was younger, how he'd wet his father's documents and ran away from home in fear of getting scolded. How she felt was not childish. She was justified in the feelings of neglect she'd felt. She had given in to her siblings' demands countless times. It was obviously something that she was supposed to do, she thought. She gasped as shock ran through her. When had she begun to think that was an obvious thing? The Duke sat next to her and gently pulled her head onto his shoulder. He told her not to hold back and to cry. Tears gathered in her eyes at his kindness, and like a dam that burst, she began to wail. After some time had passed, Karina sat with red-rimmed eyes. When was the last time she'd cried so freely? She fussed over Milon's shirt, wet with her tears. He told her to say thank you instead of apologizing. Apologies loses its meaning over time the more you say it, and eventually people would ignore it, he explained. It would also degrade her image, and she would start to feel lesser than her actual self-worth. But saying thank you would make her feel happier instead. She realized the truth behind his words. She'd always apologized for everything, even things she didn't do, and it had weighed her down. She smiled beautifully and thanked him. She told him happily to call her by her first name. Milyon agreed, and he blushed a deep red. As he left Karina's room, the bolter approached Milyon and handed him a letter. It was from Duke Periel. His response was full of insolence, and Milyon could hardly believe his eyes. He crushed the letter in his hands as he said in an irritated tone, "It will take some time for him to arrive." She had developed a new hobby recently. Karina would wake up every morning and she would draw as she watched the Duke train. She picked up the book that she'd used to make a list of everything she'd like to see or do before she died. As she thought about what to write, Milyon spoke up, startling her. He leaned on the doorframe with a bored look on his face. He approached her and grabbed the painting she had been doing, and she gasped in surprise. It was a picture of him as he swung his sword. She explained embarrassingly that he looked amazing while swinging his sword in the moonlight, and he blushed at her words. He asked if she'd like to join him on his round of inspection, and she said, "Yes," excitedly. She called out his name softly with red cheeks. The Duke glanced at her, and he too blushed at her beauty. She looked like a regular noble lady now, the Duke thought to himself as they sat in the carriage. He asked her about her etiquette lessons, and she explained sadly that she was taught by someone else, unlike the rest of her siblings, who were taught by their parents. He then questioned her about the book that had caught his eye, and she explained she wanted to make a to-do list. She didn't mention it was a list to do before she died. He said that it didn't need to be extravagant and told her she tends to overthink a lot. As he got out of the carriage, he spun around and said with a bright smile, "Karina, the world is wide, so don't allow yourself to be caged and repressed by your memories of the county." He explained in a comforting tone that she had simply outgrew the county like a tree that outgrew its small pot, and now it was time to experience a better and brighter world. She smiled at him gently. She whispered her thanks as they walked on. Karina was surprised that they had a festival in the north, especially because of the upcoming winter. The Duke explained that people in the north ate the meat from the demonic beasts that were hunted because roads to the north were closed during this time and trade routes were cut off. She was shocked and intrigued at the idea for eating demonic meat. She had many questions, and he found her reaction so obvious. They used other parts of the beasts for much-needed necessities like ornaments and jewelry, he explained. Karina looked around, fascination sparkling in her eyes, but the Duke suddenly pulled her into his arms. She'd almost bumped into another person passing by. Before she could say anything, a soldier called out to the Duke. A demonic beast had appeared. As he jumped down the fortress walls, he told the soldiers to protect Karina. She looked on, worryingly. The soldiers reassured her that the Duke was more than capable of handling the beast. She wanted to be of help to Million. An idea came to mind, and she pulled out a sheet of paper and drew. She ran down the stairs hurriedly to the Duke. She wiped his face, which was messed with blood. But he grabbed her hand and questioned in a low tone why her hand felt so cold, and why didn't the soldiers give her a blanket to ward off the cold? The soldiers looked on in surprise. Was this really the cold Duke they all knew? He gave her a stone but explained that it was actually called a heron. The soldiers' eyes rounded in shock. The Duke, who was usually cold and strict, was kind and caring to the lady. Million explained that it was a rare item that came from subduing demonic beasts. Why would he give her something so precious? Million told her that there was a superstition many believed in the north. If you gave a heron to a weak person, it would bring them good health. She thanked him and smiled shyly. They decided to head home, but before they could, she heard her name and turned around. It was the doctor that had treated her in the south. She was surprised to see him all the way in the north. The Duke introduced himself, and the doctor realized that Karina was indeed a noble lady from the Leopold family. Their engagement had, of course, reached his ears too.